Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to show you how to properly iron your fabric, especially if you have a really big piece of fabric. So before you actually touch your iron to your fabric, you want to make sure that you know what your fabric is made out of. This one I have right here is made of 100% cotton. Once you know what your fabric is made of, then you can make sure you set your iron to the proper heat setting. So the irons will generally have some sort of a dial, a little circle that will spin on the inside, and it will have little words written on the inside of different types of fabric. So the fabric I have, again, is cotton, so I'm going to turn it all the way to the right. That's where it says cotton linen. But there are also settings for rayon, wool, silk, nylon, acrylic. So if I hold my iron up close, you can see those words in there. So make sure that your iron is set to the proper material for what your fabric's made from. So I have some pink fabric here, and I have it to where it is facing wrong side up. I personally like to start ironing wrong side up in case you make a mistake with your iron or in case your fabric has a bad reaction to the heat. If that does happen, you want to make sure you know that before you ruin the fabric. So oftentimes if you start with the wrong side up when you iron, it will keep you from destroying your fabric with an iron. So I'm just going to start kind of on one corner, and I'm just going to move my iron back and forth over my fabric, making sure that when I set my fabric on my ironing board that I use my hands to kind of flatten it out so I don't iron any folds in there on accident. Whenever you are using your iron, you want to make sure that your iron is constantly moving. Okay, you don't want to leave your iron sitting down flat on the hot part onto the fabric, because you could burn your fabric or even burn a hole in it. Also, when you use your iron, you want to make sure that whenever you set it down to move your fabric, you want to make sure you're setting it down on its butt, on its bottom part. You never want this hot part to be setting down flat, not on a counter or on an ironing board, because you could start a fire. So as I finish one section of the fabric, I'm going to then pick it up and move it. And I'm going to make sure that I iron all parts of the fabric. And then when I'm done with this side, I'm going to turn it over and iron on the other side. So I finished that side. Now I'm going to turn my fabric over. And I'm going to start at a corner here, and now I have my right side up. The reason you want to iron both sides is because you want to make sure you get out any folds or creases that were in it before. So if you look, you can see that there's a crease right here. So this fabric used to be folded this direction, but right here there's a crease the other direction. So this fabric used to have this end folded under. So whenever you iron both sides of the fabric, that makes sure that you get out both of those kinds of creases. Again, I'm just using my hands to flatten my fabric on my ironing board before I actually use my iron, because I don't want to purposely put in any kind of a crease that I don't want. Okay, so I'm done with this section. I'm going to move my fabric over. iron, you want to use a little bit of pressure with your hand on the iron, but you don't want to just force the iron down because that could burn your fabric as well. And I've got my last little section here. And there we go. My large piece of fabric is now all ironed. Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to properly put your fabric on grain. The first thing you need to do that is to identify where your selvages are. The easiest way, I think, to identify your selvage is to find the edge that has a little bit that's a different color than your fabric. So my fabric is pink, obviously, and then you see this end has a white rectangle on it. So this is where my selvage is going to be. If your fabric does not have a part that is a different color than the fabric, then another way to figure out where your selvage is to just find the edge that is finished. So this edge is not finished. So it has all these little threads up here. Okay, it looks like these little loose hairs. That is an unfinished edge. This is the finished edge. So you can see that it does not have any little hairs or any little frillies up here. And sometimes it'll still be discolored a little bit on the wrong side. So again, my fabric is pink, but whenever I look at the wrong side, you can still see this little part here that is a white color. So once you have figured out where your selvage is, you're going to turn the fabric to where the selvage is at the end, and you're looking right at the selvage right next to you. Then you want to move your fabric, and you are going to take some fabric shears, and you are going to cut a little bit into the selvage, just about an inch or so away from the edge. So my edge is here, and I'm just going to cut into my fabric only about a ½ inch. So I want to cut through the selvage and only about a ½ inch into the fabric itself. So again, you want to make sure that your cut is straight for obvious reasons. Just cut it like that. So I'm going to hold the main piece of fabric in one hand, and I'm going to hold this little piece I snipped in my other. And I'm just going to rip this and rip it all the way down. So what it should do is it should rip along one long thread all the way down. So I'm going to start ripping. Sometimes at the end of the other selvage, you have to pull kind of tight to pull it through. So this is the part that I just ripped off. If you look at this end, it measures probably about 1.5 inches or so. But if you look at this end, it measures probably only about 1/2 inch. So that means this edge was not previously on grain. On grain means that now we know we have one perfectly straight line here. So it is now going to make us these little frilly edges. Okay, and we're going to need to cut that off in our next step, but now this fabric is on grain. Okay, so now I'm ready to start cutting my fabric. I have my selvage edge right here, and then this edge right here is the one that I just put on grain. So I don't want to start out my sewing project either side here. I don't want to start it out on my selvage, and I don't want to start it out on this part I just put on grain, because this is now an unfinished edge and I need to cut these little frillies off. So before you start measuring for any sewing project, you want to make sure you cut off this selvage, and you want to make sure that you have cut off the frilly part from where you put your fabric on grain. So I'm left-handed, so I'm going to turn my fabric a little bit so hopefully you can see, and I'm going to adjust my camera a little bit too. So this is the end that I just put on grain. It's kind of wavy right here. And then this is my selvage. So I'm going to start by cutting a straight line from my selvages. I'm going to fold the selvages together, especially if you have a long piece of fabric or a really large piece of fabric. You want to start by cutting off the selvage part first, because you know the selvage is straight. The selvage is always going to be straight. So, it doesn't have to be folded perfectly, but you want these edges here, where your selvage is, to be lined up perfectly. So I have my selvages lined up. Okay, and now I'm going to cut. So my selvage, I can see it ends right at the end of this white rectangle. And I can also see it down here. It is where my fabric starts getting a little bit smoother, because sometimes the selvage is a little bit rough feeling. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my fabric shears. I'm actually going to stand up when I do this. I'm going to take my fabric shears and I'm just going to cut all the way down, cutting straight, but I want to make sure I remove all of the selvage part. So I have that cut that part now, and I can just toss this in the trash. And this is the frilly end. So I need to cut this straight as well. So I'm going to unfold it, and I'm going to move my frilly end. I'm going to start from this end since I'm left-handed. So you can see the little frilly part. Again, you can see these waves in here. And I'm just going to cut straight. I'm going to cut, not obviously right on the line, but just right next to it. I'm not trying to cut anything off here. I'm just trying to get rid of this little wavy part. And you want to just keep on cutting until you cut all the way down. I'm going to move my fabric and just keep on cutting. Again, I'm going to move my fabric a little bit. So again, this part I just cut off, I can toss that in the trash. So now, starting from this, let me adjust it. Starting from this corner here, this is the end that used to be the wavy part that we put on grain, but now we cut it and it's straight. And this used to be the selvage that, oh, excuse me, the other way used to be the selvage that we just cut off. So now when we get ready to make a sewing project, we can start measuring from this edge and from this edge, because now we know they're both straight. In this video, I will show you how to measure fabric properly before you cut it for a sewing project. So, previously I have cut 2 straight edges, so I will adjust my camera and I will show you. So this edge here is where my selvage used to be, but I cut it off with a straight, I cut it off in a straight edge. And this here is where my line was that I put my fabric on grain, but I cut that frilly part off. So this is a straight edge and this is a straight edge. So when I'm measuring it, I'm going to start from one of these 2 edges, depending on which side I'm measuring. I'm going to show you how to measure the fabric for the main piece of fabric for a pillowcase that we make in class, but the same technique can be used to measure fabric for any size that you need. So I have my long tape measure here. This is the long piece of my fabric. So before I even measure for my project, I'm going to measure the fabric as it is now. So I'm going to put the end of my tape measure here, and I'm just going to pull it all the way, or excuse me, I'm going to move it all the way down to measure how long this fabric is already. So we can see the fabric ended up to be about 42 inches or so. And the other direction, I'm going to put the end of my tape measure here, and I'm going to do the same kind of thing that I did with my other side. And I'm just going to measure how big the fabric is this way. And this side ended up measuring about 30 inches or so. So for the main piece of fabric, for the pillowcase, I need it to be 40.5 inches by 26.5 inches. So this is the longer side of my fabric, so I'm going to do the longer measurement on this side. So my long measurement that I need is 40.5 inches. I'm going to put my tape measure on the end, and I'm going to stretch it out as I did just a minute ago. And I'm going to hold my tape measure and my fabric together as I move it down. And I'm going to identify where 40.5 inches is, which is right here. I'll move it closer. There we go. So here's where 40.5 inches is now. I'm going to take a seam gauge and I'm just going to line my seam gauge up, with the end of the fabric and with the tape measure. So I'm going to use a fabric marker. I'm going to use the air-soluble ink, which is the purple color, and I'm going to just make a little line to indicate where I need to cut. So there's my purple line right here. And so that indicates where 40.5 inches is. So I just need to cut off this part and I need to cut it off all the way down. I'm also now going to measure the other end of the fabric. So I'm going to turn it this direction. I'm going to use my scissors as a weight. And starting from this direction, I'm going to measure 26.5 inches. And I'm just going to use, I'm actually going to start at 26.5, and I'm going to put that marker on this end. And I'm going to stretch my tape measure out. And I'll kind of move this for you so you guys can see. Same thing, I'm going to take my seam gauge and I'm going to line it up with the tape measure and this end of the fabric. So now I'm going to take my fabric marker again. I'm going to use the purple side, the air soluble ink, and I'm just going to make a little line as well to indicate where I need to cut my fabric. So this little purple line that I just made right there is going to indicate that from this edge to this line is 26.5 inches. So I will just need to cut this way, and I will need to cut at the 40.5 inch mark, which is right here. In that last video, I showed you guys how to make the marks with a marker where the cuts need to be made for your pillowcase fabric. So I'm going to move my camera. Hopefully you can see. There we go. And this edge I measured to be 40.5 inches. I'm going to measure it again before I cut. You always want to measure twice and cut once. You can't do it the other way around. You can't cut twice and measure once. So I'm going to put my, I'm going to move this over. There we go, so you can see. I'm going to put the end of my tape measure next to the end of my fabric, and I'm going to hold it in place. And I'm just going to keep my hand here, and then I'm going to move my fabric on down. Okay, so right at to where 40.5 inches is right here, and that is where I had made this little mark here with my fabric marker. So here's the mark I made with my fabric marker. This edge here, this is my other selvage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my selvedges and I'm going to fold them together. So my selvedges are together. So don't worry about if these ends of the fabric are matching up. That doesn't matter. We just want to make sure that our selvedges are matching up because we know our selvage is always straight. So we're gonna do this, right just here. So I'm left-handed, so what I'm gonna do, hopefully so you guys can see, is this is where the mark is, and I'm just gonna make a little bit of an indent, or excuse me, a little bit of a cut where that marker is, right here, and then I'm gonna turn it to where I can cut it. So I made my little slit already, and I'm just going to continue to cut all the way down, making sure I cut straight. So this piece I cut off, you can just toss that in the trash. So I'm going to unfold it, and I'm going to measure it again. So, let me move the fabric. Here is the edge. I'm going to start my tape measure there, bring my tape measure down, hold this in place as I move my fabric, and then I've got the end of my fabric into my tape measure, and it does measure to 40.5 inches. So now I just need to cut the other direction. I did make a mark the other direction where 26.5 inches is. Well, maybe I did. Oh, yes, I did. It was the other side. So my marker is right here. I don't know if you can see. It's right there. And this side, I'm not going to fold this side just because this edge here is not the selvage. You can fold it along this side if you want to, but I'm left-handed and I'm going to try to save a little time on this video. So here's my little marker. I'm going to start by making a slit there, and I'm just going to follow that slit all the way down to where I cut it all the way down. I'm actually going to stand up while I cut this. I think that's a little bit easier for me. And then move my fabric some more. So this piece that I just cut off, you can save to make a scrunchie or something else. So now I should have my fabric cut to where it is 40.5 inches by 26.5 inches. Again, I'm going to measure it. So tape measure at the end of my fabric. Move my tape measure down. Hold this in place as I move my fabric. Good, that does end at 40.5 inches. And then I'm going to measure the other direction. And this should measure roughly 26.5 inches. And it does. 26.5 inches. So that is my main fabric for my pillowcase. And I am ready to start the steps for my pillowcase.